Individuals who grow up in significant dysfunction often suffer from confusing and stressful inner conflicts. For example, when Josh's alcoholic Uncle Bill asks for $100, Josh wants to say no, but then he feels so anxious and guilty that he says yes. But then he immediately feels angry with himself and guilty for giving away precious family dollars that he knows Uncle Bill will only drink away. Poor Josh, he just can't win. He feels miserable if he gives Uncle Bill the money and miserable if he doesn't, all because of an inner conflict. So how can Josh resolve such inner conflicts that keep him miserable? Well, first he needs to understand how his brain works. Josh has a higher brain behind his forehead, which I call the adult brain, and a lower brain behind the back of his neck, which I call the wounded child brain. Both parts of his brain produce thoughts, but the stories they tell are sometimes in conflict, particularly in stressful situations. Thoughts from the adult brain are flexible and based on what's actually happening in the here and now. Thoughts from the wounded child brain are rigid and based on past pain in the form of simple stimulus response and fight or flight. So how does this relate to Josh's inner conflict? Well, Josh grew up with an alcoholic father and a depressed mother who were unable to meet his needs. So being an immature child, he concluded that there must be something wrong with him. Otherwise, why would his dad always be angry with him? And why would his mother rarely pay attention to him? So quite logically, he decided to become what he thought his parents needed him to be, so he could finally obtain their love. In the process, he came to view his feelings and needs as the problem, which is why even now, as an adult, he feels guilty if he even thinks of saying no to anyone, because his wounded child brain will scream at him that that would be selfish, and then no one would ever like him or love him. So when Josh finally appears in my office for his first therapy session complaining of stress, and I obtain the rest of his story through my intake interview, I then explain the difference between his adult brain and his wounded child brain. I further explain that his inner conflict is the result of two very different stories being told to him within his own mind, one from his adult brain and the other from his wounded child brain. And then I help him learn to weed out the distorted stories of the wounded child brain from the accurate stories of his adult brain, so he can see situations more clearly and then make better decisions for himself. And here's one way I help him do that. I give Josh a piece of paper and ask him to make two columns, one labeled my wounded child and the other my adult. Next, I instruct him to write down in the correct column the stories his wounded child is telling him about his uncle's request for $100, keeping in mind that these stories are usually filled with fear and shame. Here's what he wrote. If I say no to my uncle, then I'm being mean, selfish, and a bad nephew, which would make me a terrible person. And then he'll be mad at me and stop loving me. Next, I instruct Josh to write down in the second column the facts of the situation as seen from his adult brain, which can be difficult for someone who can't say no. So as a tip to help him identify the stories from his adult brain, I ask him to imagine that it's his best friend in this exact situation. What advice would you give your best friend? Here's what he wrote. I tell my best friend that $100 is a lot of money and his uncle's only going to drink it away, which would not be helpful for him or his uncle. I will tell him that saying no would not be mean or selfish, but the right thing to do for both of them. I then ask Josh which story makes more sense to him, and he says, well, the advice I would give my best friend, which of course comes from his adult brain, and most certainly is the advice Josh should follow as well. If you'd like help resolving your inner conflicts, then visit my website, SerenityOnlineTherapy.com, to learn more about the online services I provide. If you like this video, please click the thumbs up button and then subscribe to my channel to hear more from me. And finally, keep paying attention to your life. Until next time.